Ethan Carter had always believed that a home was more than just walls and a roof. It was a living repository of memories, traditions, and personal triumphs. A decorated military veteran turned dedicated city official, Ethan's life had taught him the value of integrity, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. That's why the old colonial house he inherited from his late grandmother, nestled on a tree-lined street in a sleepy suburb, meant the world to him. Its weathered brick facade, wraparound porch, and original hardwood floors spoke of a time when family values were cherished, and every creak in the floorboard whispered stories of the past. Since returning to civilian life, Ethan had devoted himself to restoring the home with equal parts modern ingenuity and tender nostalgia. Every weekend, after long days at the city hall, he would roll up his sleeves and carefully repaint trim, repair the aging roof, or plant new flowers in the garden. In these moments, the house transformed into a sanctuary, a safe haven from the hectic demands of city politics, and a homage to his family's legacy. Yet, tranquility in the neighborhood was about to be shattered by an unexpected adversary. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of a local homeowners association, HOA, had long ruled the community with an iron fist. With her meticulously coiffed hair, sharp tongue, and a penchant for issuing final warnings on flimsy technicalities, Karen saw herself as the arbiter of neighborhood perfection. Her vision was a place where every house, every lawn, and every porch light conformed to an inflexible, almost obsessive, standard of aesthetics and order. One warm spring evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with soft hues of lavender and gold, Ethan decided to install a new set of energy-efficient LED lights along his wraparound porch. The gentle glow was meant to be both welcoming and eco-friendly, a modern upgrade that still respected the home's classic charm. However, as the soft radiance emerged in the dusk, it caught the critical eye of Karen, who was patrolling her domain like a self-appointed guardian of proper living. Without warning, Karen appeared at his front gate. Her stance was rigid, her eyes narrowed with disapproval. "Ethan, what do you think you're doing?" she demanded in a tone that brooked no argument. The abrupt intrusion into his evening peace startled him, but he quickly composed himself. "I'm simply installing energy-efficient lighting," he explained calmly. "They're not only environmentally friendly, but they also accentuate the historic beauty of this home." Karen's lips curled into a disdainful smirk as she shook her head. "Energy efficiency is no excuse for sacrificing our community's aesthetic standards," she declared. "Your lights are too bright, an eyesore that disrupts the harmony of our neighborhood." In her eyes, every detail of his home was subject to the arbitrary edicts of the HOA, and any deviation from her vision was nothing short of a transgression. Her words stung, for Ethan had always prided himself on preserving not only his property, but also his family's history. Here was a woman insisting that he bow to an organization that cared more about rigid conformity than about the spirit of community. Before Ethan could offer any further explanation, Karen produced a crisp, final warning notice from her ever-present folder. "This isn't a mere suggestion, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone as cold as the paper in her hand. "The HOA rules apply to everyone, even you. Fix your lights or prepare to face the consequences." As the evening deepened into night, Ethan retreated inside with the notice burning in his pocket. The once comforting shadows of the home now seemed fraught with the promise of conflict. In that moment, he vowed that no bureaucratic overreach would force him to compromise the integrity of the house he had inherited. Little did he know that this confrontation with Karen was merely the opening salvo in a long, bitter struggle between a man determined to honor his family's legacy and an HOA leader obsessed with enforcing her own vision of order. Ethan sat on the creaking old porch steps, eyes fixed on the illuminated path he had so lovingly created. The gentle hum of the neighborhood, so familiar and comforting, now felt ominously charged with the threat of tyranny. As the night deepened, his mind churned with the memories of his grandmother's words about pride, perseverance, and standing up for what was right. In that silent moment, the inherited house transformed from a cherished sanctuary into a battleground where the forces of personal legacy and arbitrary regulation were destined to collide. The following morning brought with it an unsettling chill, as if the air itself had grown heavy with impending strife. Ethan awoke to find an envelope taped prominently to his front door. Its crisp white paper bore a bold red header, "Official Notice of Violation." With a sinking heart, he tore it open to reveal a fine, a staggering $750 penalty, for violating community lighting standards. The charge was as nebulous as it was unfounded, yet Karen's signature loomed at the bottom of the notice, a stark reminder of her self-appointed authority. Before Ethan could fully process the shock, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, he found Karen standing there, arms folded and an expression of smug satisfaction playing on her lips. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she purred. "I trust you received my notice last night? The rules are clear. You must dim those lights or remove them entirely. Our neighborhood is known for its serene, understated beauty, not for neon brilliance." Ethan's eyes met hers steadily as he replied, "I respect our community standards, but these lights meet all local regulations. They're energy efficient and do not cause any disturbance." His tone was measured, yet beneath it lay a growing sense of indignation. Karen's smile widened into a sneer. "Local regulations? I'm afraid you misunderstand. The HOA guidelines are the law here. You're in violation of not only our standards, but also the implicit covenant all homeowners agree to when joining this community." She waved the notice as if it were an irrefutable edict. "If you won't comply voluntarily, I'll be forced to take further action." Within hours, Ethan's once peaceful property became a hive of activity. A trio of uniformed inspectors arrived at his door, clipboards in hand, ready to assess his property for infractions. Their presence was both invasive and intimidating. Karen had clearly pulled strings behind the scenes, mobilizing every resource available to enforce her will. Despite Ethan's calm explanations and presentation of local ordinances that clearly supported his modifications, the inspectors' faces remained impassive, duty-bound to record every minor detail. As the day wore on, word of Ethan's violation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors, who had once admired his respectful stewardship of his inherited home, now whispered in hushed tones about the troublemaker, whose lights disrupted the pristine order of their community. Even as Ethan gathered copies of local property codes and carefully annotated legal precedents, Karen continued her daily rounds, ensuring that every passerby knew who was in the wrong. Late in the afternoon, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table poring over municipal guidelines, his phone buzzed with a message from a local councilman. The note hinted at irregularities in the HOA's recent actions and suggested that several residents were questioning Karen's unilateral decisions. Encouraged by this glimmer of support, Ethan felt his resolve harden. He began drafting a formal complaint, complete with references to zoning laws and civil rights protections, determined to fight back against what he saw as blatant overreach. Karen, meanwhile, was undeterred. That evening, as dusk fell over the neighborhood, she posted another notice, this one warning of further penalties if Ethan failed to comply with the HOA's aesthetic standards. Her tone was now more aggressive, and the fine print hinted at legal recourse should she be forced to escalate the matter further. In a short span of 24 hours, the situation had morphed from an innocent misunderstanding into a full-blown power struggle. Ethan, once content in his quiet routine of home repair and reflection, now found himself on the defensive against an institution that prized conformity above individual rights. And Karen? She reveled in every opportunity to remind him and everyone else that in her eyes, no one was above the letter of the HOA rulebook. As night settled in, Ethan stood by his window watching the inspectors leave, their clipboards clutched tightly, as if holding secrets that could change the fate of his cherished home. The fine, the warnings, and the very public display of authority had all converged to send one clear message. In this community, dissent was not tolerated. And with Karen at the helm, any deviation from her meticulously crafted vision would be met with swift, unyielding force. In the days that followed, the quiet suburban streets began to murmur with an undercurrent of unrest. While Ethan sought to understand the legal basis of Karen's actions, he soon discovered disturbing patterns behind the veneer of community order. Neighbors confided that they, too, had been subjected to fines and threats, but unlike Ethan, many were too intimidated or confused to challenge the status quo. Whispers of false violations and secret donations to the HOA coffers abounded. Determined to get to the bottom of the matter, Ethan set out on his own quiet investigation. Late one evening, after carefully securing his beloved inherited home, he began reviewing archived meeting minutes and HOA records. The more he read, the more it became clear that Karen's relentless enforcement was not simply about maintaining aesthetics. It was about consolidating power. He uncovered vague references to community enhancement fees and special assessments that had inexplicably boosted Karen's personal finances. Rumors suggested that she had been using HOA funds to pay for luxury vacations and extravagant renovations to her own modest home, all under the guise of community improvement. A neighborhood barbecue a week later, a rare occasion when residents gathered in a spirit of camaraderie, Ethan quietly broached the subject with an old friend, Martin, who had long resented the heavy-handedness of the HOA. "Have you ever wondered why fines disappear as quickly as they're issued?" Martin whispered over the hum of conversation. "I've seen receipts that don't add up, and I'm not the only one noticing irregularities." Bolstered by this secret support, Ethan began to set up discreet measures of his own. He installed hidden cameras near the front entrance and in common areas where Karen often made her rounds. Every interaction, every harsh word was recorded, evidence of a regime that was less about community safety and more about personal vendetta. Over the next few days, the cameras captured startling scenes. Karen issuing fines over trivial matters, board meetings where her voice drowned out any dissent, and a series of suspicious donations deposited into her personal account. As Ethan compiled his evidence, a subtle shift began to occur within the HOA board itself. A couple of long-standing board members, who had once been silent enforcers of Karen's draconian measures, started to express doubts. In hushed conversations after meetings, they questioned whether the strict interpretation of the HOA rules was really in everyone's best interest, or if it was simply a tool for Karen's personal gain. Their discontent provided Ethan with a first tangible sign that he might not be alone in his resistance. One fateful evening, during a board meeting that had devolved into a forum for Karen's unyielding diatribe about community standards, a junior board member timidly interjected. "Is it not true," she asked, voice wavering, "that some of these fines have been misallocated? That the funds don't seem to be used for any community improvements?" Her question hung in the air, charged with tension, as a murmur of agreement rippled through a small group of attendees. Karen's face flushed with anger, but even in that moment her voice trembled, a subtle sign of cracks forming in her once impregnable facade. Emboldened by this internal dissent, Ethan reached out to several affected neighbors, urging them to document their own encounters with the HOA's overreach. Soon, a quiet network of disgruntled homeowners began exchanging emails, phone calls, and handwritten notes, a grassroots movement against the arbitrary power wielded by Karen and her cohorts. Each new piece of evidence further confirmed what Ethan had long suspected. The HOA was less a benevolent guardian of community aesthetics and more a private fiefdom ruled by an entitled few. Late into one sleepless night, Ethan sat in front of his computer, files and videos spread out before him like a patchwork of injustice. With steady determination, he began drafting a comprehensive report, a dossier that would detail every instance of abuse, every illegal fine, and every breach of trust perpetrated by the HOA. This was not just about his inherited home anymore. It was about restoring fairness to a community that had been hijacked by corruption. In that moment, as the clock ticked toward dawn, Ethan realized that he had entered a war on two fronts, one against a corrupt institution, and another to preserve the sanctity of the legacy his family had entrusted to him. With a deep breath, he saved his report and prepared to take his first decisive step toward exposing the truth, knowing that every bit of evidence gathered was a blow against tyranny, and that the battle for justice had only just begun. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Ethan's morning routine was violently interrupted. As he shuffled to the kitchen for his first cup of coffee, a deafening clatter from outside jolted him awake. Rushing to the window, he was greeted by a surreal sight. Heavy machinery and a couple of burly men were busily tearing into his once pristine driveway. Large, intimidating bulldozers were at work, churning up concrete and gravel, as if erasing years of careful upkeep. In the midst of this chaos, Karen was perched atop a pickup truck, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and menace. "Good morning, Ethan," she called out, her voice echoing across the now-disrupted suburban calm. "I hope you're ready for progress. The HOA has decided your driveway is obstructing our plans for a wider, more accessible community walkway." Ethan's heart pounded in disbelief. This was not merely about aesthetics anymore. It was an outright assault on his property rights. He darted outside, his voice firm yet controlled. "Karen, you have no authority to do this. My driveway is part of my property. I have all the permits and legal documents confirming that. This is nothing more than a blatant overreach." Karen scoffed. "Legal documents mean nothing here if you refuse to conform. Consider this your final notice to comply with our new community improvement plan." With that, she signaled to one of the men, who promptly secured notice on a clipboard to her truck reading, "Noncompliance will result in immediate utility suspension." By mid-morning, the situation escalated further. As Ethan attempted to restore order, his phone rang incessantly. Calls from neighbors distraught and confused poured in reporting that their water and electricity had inexplicably been cut off. One resident mentioned that her air conditioning had shut down in the middle of a sweltering day. Another lamented that even the streetlights were flickering erratically. It quickly became apparent that Karen's wrath was not confined solely to Ethan's property. She was targeting the entire block in a bid to force compliance and instill fear. Determined not to be cowed, Ethan retreated into the sanctuary of his study. There, he methodically organized the growing mountain of evidence he had collected over the past weeks. Videos of hidden cameras capturing Karen's underhanded dealings, copies of municipal codes disproving her claims, and detailed accounts of residents suffering from the sudden utility shutdowns. His resolve hardened with every piece of undeniable proof. This wasn't just about his own rights. It was about reclaiming the neighborhood from a tyrant who believed that power came from fear and intimidation. Later that afternoon, a hastily arranged HOA meeting was called at the local community center, a venue that had, until now, been a neutral ground for neighborhood discussion. Rumors of Karen's extreme measures had spread like wildfire, and a palpable tension filled the room as community members took their seats. The atmosphere was charged. Half the attendees wore expressions of indignation, while the other half seemed uncertain and fearful. Karen opened the meeting with her customary air of superiority. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you are aware, our community standards are being compromised by noncompliant behavior," she began, her tone authoritative. "I have taken necessary measures to ensure that our neighborhood remains a beacon of order and beauty." Her words were met with a mix of murmurs and uneasy silence. Ethan, clutching a thick file of evidence, calmly stepped forward. "With all due respect, Karen," he said, his voice steady and resolute, "the measures you've taken are not only illegal, but also destructive to our community. My driveway, as well as the utilities of many homes, have been tampered with under the guise of community improvement. I have in my possession copies of local ordinances and court rulings that clearly state that the HOA has no authority over these private matters." He proceeded to distribute printed excerpts from municipal codes, along with still images captured by his hidden cameras. The room fell silent as his words sank in. A murmur of discontent began to ripple among the residents. One by one, they nodded, some exchanging glances that said, "We've been suffering too." Karen's face reddened with a mix of anger and desperation. "This is a misunderstanding," she insisted, trying to salvage her position. "The HOA is simply enforcing community standards." But her voice wavered, and the evidence laid out before the room left little room for debate. An elderly neighbor, whose water had been off for an entire afternoon, stood up. "These are my rights, and I won't stand by while you bully us into submission," she declared. Her impassioned words resonated with many in the room. Others began sharing their own experiences. Stories of unauthorized fines, arbitrary rules, and now the loss of essential services. By the end of the meeting, the mood had shifted dramatically. What began as a controlled assembly of complaints had transformed into a collective outcry against Karen and the corrupt practices of the HOA. Several board members, previously silent, voiced their support for Ethan's claims. It was clear that the community was no longer willing to tolerate these extreme measures. Karen's desperate tactics had backfired. Cornered and exposed, she scrambled for words, her earlier defiance giving way to a panicked insistence that the situation would soon be resolved. Yet, her once ironclad authority was crumbling. The HOA's attempt to enforce draconian measures had ignited a spark of resistance that could not be easily extinguished. In that moment, as Ethan looked around at his fellow homeowners, now united in their quest for justice, it became evident that Karen's grip on power was slipping. Her extreme measures, intended to silence dissent, had instead sparked a revolution of accountability. And as the community rallied together, Ethan's file of evidence stood as a testament to the fact that no tyrant, no matter how entitled, could trample on the rights of individuals determined to protect their homes and their dignity. As autumn deepened and the chill of dissent settled over the neighborhood, Karen's desperation reached a boiling point. With her power rapidly evaporating and the community rallying behind Ethan's relentless quest for justice, she resolved on one final audacious maneuver, one that would either salvage her crumbling authority or expose her for the fraud she had become. One crisp evening, as the golden light faded into a murky dusk, Karen picked up the phone and dialed 911. In a measured yet urgent tone, she reported that Ethan's newly installed porch lights were not merely an eyesore, but a dangerous public disturbance that was blinding drivers and endangering pedestrians. Her description painted a picture of chaotic luminescence, disrupting the serene suburban night. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens shattered the calm. Ethan, who had just finished reviewing more evidence of the HOA's malfeasance, was startled by the commotion outside. He glanced at his clock, then at the soft glow of his carefully installed energy-efficient lights. Knowing they were in full compliance with local regulations, he braced himself as two police cars pulled up in front of his house. Karen, already standing on his porch with a look of fierce determination, stepped forward to greet the officers. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," Karen declared, her tone a mix of indignation and triumph. "This is an urgent matter. Mr. Carter's lights are causing a public hazard." The officers exchanged a brief glance before addressing Ethan directly. Calmly, he replied, "My lights are installed according to every safety and environmental regulation we have. In fact, they're designed to reduce energy waste and enhance nighttime visibility." With measured resolve, he reached into his jacket and produced his city official badge, a tangible symbol of his integrity and authority. One officer, his expression softening into skepticism, said, "Ma'am, we've checked the complaint and found no evidence of any public disturbance. Mr. Carter's lights are perfectly legal." The mood shifted palpably. Karen's confident facade cracked as the officers questioned her claims. Embarrassed yet unwilling to retreat, she mumbled a hasty excuse and backed away, leaving the scene with her accusations unproven and her credibility bruised. But Karen wasn't finished. That very night, in the shadowed confines of her opulently decorated home office, she convened a clandestine meeting with a notorious private investigator, a man known in certain circles for his willingness to bend or even break the rules. "We need to find something, anything that can discredit Ethan Carter," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "Dig up dirt, uncover secret. I want evidence that shows his facade for what it is." The PI nodded grimly, understanding that the stakes were now higher than ever. Over the following days, while the community buzzed with rumors about the police intervention, Ethan, ever cautious, upgraded his home's security system. High-definition cameras were strategically placed to monitor every inch of his property, ensuring that no trespass went undocumented. Late one night, as the neighborhood lay cloaked in silence, Ethan's vigilance paid off. While reviewing his security feeds, he noticed a figure skulking near his garage, a dark silhouette moving stealthily against the backdrop of his well-lit home. Zooming in, he caught the unmistakable image of the private investigator attempting to force open a side window leading directly into his secure garage. Ethan's heart pounded as he realized the gravity of the situation. The PI's actions were not only unethical, but also illegal, clearly a breach of privacy and a blatant act of trespassing. Fueled by a mix of anger and resolve, Ethan saved every frame of the footage. "This is it," he murmured, knowing that this indisputable evidence would shatter any remaining semblance of legitimacy in Karen's actions. Every moment of the PI's clandestine intrusion was a testament to the lengths Karen was willing to go, and the depths of her desperation. Armed with the video evidence and a comprehensive dossier documenting the police call and her previous overreaches, Ethan prepared for the final confrontation. The stage was set for the next HOA meeting, where the community had already gathered, still reeling from the recent upheavals. Inside the community center that crisp evening, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Neighbors, their faces a mixture of outrage and cautious hope, filled the room. When Ethan took the podium, the murmurs died down. With steady, resolute authority, he began, "Friends, I stand before you today not just as a homeowner, but as someone who believes in fairness, transparency, and the right to protect one's property. Over the past few weeks, we've witnessed actions that have gone far beyond enforcing community standards. They become acts of intimidation and outright criminal behavior." Ethan then unveiled the security footage on a large screen, the images of the PI's trespass filling the room. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the damning evidence played out in real time. The undeniable proof of Karen's willingness to deploy illegal tactics struck a deep chord with everyone present. In that charged moment, as neighbors exchanged looks of dismay and vindication, Karen's final desperate move collapsed under the weight of truth. The community, now united and resolute, surged forward with voices demanding accountability. Karen's authority, already teetering on the brink, was now irreparably shattered. Ethan concluded, "Let this be a lesson. No one, no matter how self-appointed or entitled, has the right to trample on the law or our community's trust. We deserve better, and we will not stand for tyranny." As the room erupted into applause and fervent support, Karen's fate was sealed. Her final, desperate act had not only backfired, it had exposed her for the corrupt enforcer she truly was. In that moment of unity and resolve, the community embraced a newfound hope, a promise that justice, tempered with integrity, would prevail over tyranny and abuse of power. In the weeks following the explosive HOA meeting, the tidal wave of discontent that Ethan had helped unleash transformed into a full-scale community uprising. Neighbors who had once lived in fearful silence now gathered in droves, demanding accountability not only from Karen, but from an entire system that had allowed her authoritarian rule to fester. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, a gathering that had long been a formality, the atmosphere was charged with determination and a palpable sense of liberation. From the moment the doors opened at the community center, it was clear that change was inevitable. Homeowners, emboldened by the incontrovertible evidence Ethan had presented, took their seats with expressions of quiet resolve. A hastily organized petition, signed by nearly every resident, was distributed at the entrance. The petition, a masterful display of unity, demanded Karen's immediate removal from office and a comprehensive review of the HOA's governance practices. Karen, who had once commanded the room with an imperious presence, now appeared visibly rattled. As the meeting commenced, the board members, some of whom had long harbored private doubts about her methods, found themselves cornered by the collective will of the community. One by one, they voiced their concerns. "We cannot, in good conscience, allow these abuses of power to continue," declared a longtime board member, his voice thick with emotion. "It's time we put the interests of our neighbors above personal ambition." Under mounting pressure, Karen attempted to defend her actions. She launched into a rehearsed tirade about community standards and the necessity of her strict measures. But her words fell on deaf ears. The evidence was irrefutable. records of unauthorized fines, secret donations siphoned into personal accounts, and the damning footage of the private investigator trespassing on Ethan's property. Every claim she made was systematically dismantled by the clear documentation and impassioned testimonies of residents. In a decisive moment that would mark the collapse of her reign, the board unanimously voted to expel Karen from her position. The room erupted in murmurs of relief and jubilation, a long-suppressed anger finally given voice. Karen's face drained of color as she realized that her empire of intimidation had crumbled in a matter of minutes. "This isn't over," she stammered, her voice barely audible, but her threats fell flat in the charged silence that followed. As the meeting adjourned, community leaders wasted no time in alerting the local authorities. Within days, an independent audit was launched into the HOA's financial practices, revealing a trail of misappropriated funds and fraudulent activities that extended well beyond Karen's personal enrichment. The city, already sympathetic to the homeowner's plight, slapped the HOA with a record fine and mandated a complete restructuring of its governance. Board members who had quietly abetted Karen's excesses were called to account, and several faced potential legal consequences for their part in the corruption. For Ethan, the victory was both personal and communal. Not only had he defended the sanctity of his inherited home, but he had also ignited a movement that restored dignity and transparency to an institution that had long operated in the shadows. Neighbors now felt empowered to speak up about issues that affected their quality of life. In an impromptu celebration held on a sunny Saturday afternoon, residents gathered on Ethan's front lawn, a symbolic reclamation of public space that had once been overshadowed by fear. They shared stories of small victories and hopeful glances toward a future unburdened by tyrannical oversight. In the midst of the celebrations, word spread that Karen was forced to sell her own house, a move seen as the final severance of her ties to the community she once ruled. With her departure, the air of entitlement that had so long stifled individuality and neighborly compassion was replaced by a genuine commitment to fairness and mutual respect. The once oppressive HOA was reconstituted under new leadership, with transparent policies and an elected board that truly reflected the community's values. In a quiet moment after the festivities, Ethan took a solitary walk through the neighborhood. The familiar streets now seemed vibrant with a renewed sense of community spirit. Lawn ornaments were no longer symbols of conformity, but playful nods to personal taste. Porch lights, once the battleground of an absurd dispute, now glimmered proudly as testaments to individuality and progress. The transformation was not merely physical. It was a metamorphosis of community ethos, a collective realization that true beauty lay in diversity and freedom, not in rigid uniformity. As he paused by a favorite old oak tree, Ethan reflected on the journey that had led to this moment. His fight had begun as a defense of his family's legacy and his right to live freely in his own home. It had grown into a larger battle against an entrenched system of power and control. And in the end, it was a victory that resonated far beyond his property line. A victory for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed by arbitrary rules and unchecked authority. In the aftermath, as the neighborhood slowly healed from its ordeal, a new era of community engagement emerged. Meetings were held not out of fear, but with the shared purpose of building a better, more inclusive future. And for Ethan, each day became a reminder that the strength of a community lies not in the uniformity of its appearance, but in the unity of its people, a lesson learned on a well-lit porch, in a reclaimed neighborhood, and in the downfall of an entitled tyrant named Karen. In the wake of the community uprising and Karen's dramatic downfall, the legal ramifications for the HOA began to unfold with unrelenting force. The tide had turned decisively against the corrupt leadership, and it wasn't long before local authorities, spurred on by the mounting evidence, initiated a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. Ethan, now recognized as the community's staunch defender, spearheaded a class-action lawsuit on behalf of dozens of wronged homeowners. With a meticulously compiled dossier of emails, unauthorized fines, covert financial records, and damning video evidence, he presented an irrefutable case that not only detailed Karen's overreach, but also exposed a systemic abuse of power by the entire board. The legal team, bolstered by testimonies from residents who had suffered under the arbitrary penalties and utility shutdowns, argued that the HOA had operated as a private fiefdom, one that had unlawfully imposed its rules on individual property rights. The courtroom became the new battleground. During the hearings, Ethan took the stand and delivered a powerful account of the community's ordeal. His calm, steady demeanor contrasted sharply with the brazen arrogance that had once defined the HOA's meetings. He detailed how the board had misused funds intended for community improvements, how secret donations had padded personal coffers, and how Karen's relentless pursuit of conformity had directly led to the disruption of essential services. Each piece of evidence was met with growing consternation by the judge and disbelief by the HOA's legal representatives. As the trial progressed, the magnitude of the misconduct became undeniable. The presiding judge declared that the HOA's enforcement actions were not only arbitrary but illegal. In a historic ruling, the court ordered an immediate audit of the HOA's finances and operations. The audit revealed a labyrinth of fraudulent transactions and unauthorized spending, implicating several board members who had, until now, operated in the shadows of Karen's dominance. With their complicity laid bare, some of these members faced indictments on charges ranging from fraud to embezzlement. The court's verdict was a resounding victory for the community. A hefty fine was levied against the HOA, a sum so substantial that it was expected to cover restitution for the homeowners and fund necessary repairs for the damage inflicted by the rogue board. Moreover, the judge ruled that the existing HOA must be dissolved and replaced with a new, democratically elected body. This new entity would operate with strict transparency measures and would be held accountable to the very residents it was meant to serve. Ethan's final power move came during the sentencing phase. In a measured yet firm statement, he urged the court to set a precedent that no homeowner, regardless of their status or the dictates of an association, should ever be stripped of their rights. His words resonated deeply, not only with those in the courtroom, but also with homeowners across the region who had silently endured similar abuses. The judge, moved by the collective outcry and the overwhelming evidence of corruption, commended the community's resilience and affirmed that the law would always protect individual rights against institutional tyranny. In the months that followed, as the new HOA took shape and reforms were implemented, the community began to heal. The legal consequences imposed on the former board served as both a punishment for the past and a warning for the future. The dissolution of the corrupt organization marked the end of an era of intimidation and the beginning of a new chapter, one where transparency, accountability, and true community values prevailed. For Ethan and his neighbors, the legal victory was more than just a court ruling. It was a restoration of dignity and the reaffirmation that every homeowner had the right to live free from arbitrary control. The precedent set in that courtroom echoed far beyond their quiet suburb, a beacon of hope for all who had ever fought against systemic injustice. In the aftermath of the historic court ruling and the dissolution of the corrupt HOA, Karen found herself isolated in a world that had swiftly turned its back on her. The fall from power was not only public but deeply personal, and every aspect of her carefully curated image began to crumble under the relentless scrutiny of a community that had once feared her judgment. It started with whispers among neighbors that soon transformed into open mockery. Once the self-styled enforcer of order, Karen was now the subject of derisive headlines in the local paper and scathing commentary on community bulletin boards. The same residents who had once tiptoed around her glare now openly exchanged amused glances at her expense. In quiet cafes and over backyard fences, her name was spoken with a blend of disbelief and satisfaction, a stark reminder that no one was above the law. Karen's personal life, already strained by her obsessive need to control every detail, began to unravel. Financial investigations had revealed the misappropriation of funds and unauthorized spending that extended well beyond her HOA dealings. Faced with mounting legal bills and the public shaming of a court-imposed fine, she was forced to liquidate assets to pay off creditors. Her once pristine car, a symbol of her self-proclaimed success, was repossessed after defaulting on the final installment payments, a humiliating blow that underscored her sudden fall from grace. At home, the damage was equally severe. Longtime friends and acquaintances, once eager to endorse her leadership, began distancing themselves as her reputation soured. Rumors of marital discord grew louder, and it wasn't long before her estranged husband, who had silently borne the brunt of her authoritarian tendencies, filed for divorce. In the midst of personal and financial chaos, Karen's days became a series of public apologies and frantic attempts to salvage what little dignity remained. Every encounter on the street turned into a reluctant nod or a pointed remark about her now crumbling empire. The ultimate irony came when Karen was forced to relinquish her position entirely. With her removal from the HOA, she no longer held any sway over community matters. An institution that she had once manipulated with impunity was now a relic of her past. In a twist that few could have predicted, she found herself struggling to secure employment. The very skills she had touted as essential for maintaining order were now liabilities, branding her as someone whose management style was synonymous with abuse of power. In a cruel twist of fate, Karen was offered a job as an assistant property manager at a different HOA, a lowly position that was a far cry from the authoritative role she had once commanded. It was a stark, poetic punishment, forced to work under a system she had once subverted, subject to rules she had long exploited. Every day, as she reported for work, she was reminded of the irony. The community that had once cowered beneath her orders now watched from a distance, a silent testament to the fallibility of unchecked entitlement. In quiet moments, Karen would reflect on the decisions that had led her down this path, but those reflections were tinged with bitterness and regret, a far cry from the confident declarations of superiority that had once defined her. The woman who had so ardently believed in her invincibility was now confronted with the undeniable truth that authority, when abused, could vanish as quickly as it was amassed. For Ethan and the rest of the neighborhood, Karen's downfall served as a final, resounding affirmation of their collective stand against tyranny. It was a victory that was felt not just in legal terms, but in the restoration of dignity and respect, a reminder that no one, however entitled, was immune to the consequences of overstepping the bounds of fairness and decency. In the gentle glow of a late summer evening, the neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm, one free from the shadows of tyranny and heavy-handed governance. The air was filled with a sense of renewal and possibility, a marked contrast to the dark days of relentless HOA overreach. Children played in the streets as neighbors strolled along freshly painted sidewalks, each corner of the community a testament to the power of unity and collective action. Ethan, now regarded as the catalyst for change, found solace in the simple joys of his reclaimed life. His inherited home, once a battleground of wills, had returned to being the sanctuary it was always meant to be, a place where memories could be nurtured and dreams freely pursued. Every morning, he stepped onto his porch with a quiet pride, the soft hum of conversation and laughter from nearby gardens serving as a constant reminder of how far they had come. At a community gathering held in the local park, a celebratory picnic organized by the residents themselves, the transformation was unmistakable. Tables were laden with home-cooked dishes, and music filled the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves in the cool evening breeze. Conversations flowed easily, punctuated by bursts of laughter and light-hearted teasing. Even the infamous HOA notices, once a symbol of suppression, had become relics of a bygone era, now humorously displayed on a community board as a reminder of what they had overcome. In the midst of the festivities, an elderly neighbor, with a glimmer of mischief in his eye, produced a freshly printed mock violation notice addressed to Ethan. It cited an absurd infraction, having the best porch lights in the neighborhood. With a theatrical flourish, he handed it to Ethan, who grinned broadly and accepted it like a badge of honor. The crowd erupted in laughter as Ethan playfully read out the charge, his voice light and triumphant. That night, as the celebrations wound down and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Ethan took a quiet moment on his porch. The familiar sounds of the neighborhood, soft chatter, distant music, the occasional bark of a dog, wove together into a soothing symphony of community spirit. In that serene moment, it became clear that the true mic drop wasn't in the dramatic courtroom battles or the public downfall of an entitled tyrant, but in the rebirth of a community that had reclaimed its identity and dignity. The once divisive battle had united the residents, teaching them that change was possible when courage and determination met unwavering solidarity. Karen's era had faded into an anecdote, a cautionary tale of power misused and the inevitable fall of unchecked arrogance. And as the final embers of the celebration flickered in the night, the neighborhood whispered a collective promise that they would continue to cherish and protect their hard-won freedom, ensuring that no single voice, however entitled, could ever again silence the collective heartbeat of their community. Fade to black.